about something which I think is an essential part of what we're trying to achieve here in this lecture, which is, in this series of lectures, which is to get a sense of Jewish history as a religious history. Remember, I said this is a history of Judaism and of Jews practicing Judaism rather than a history of the politics of Jews or the economics of Jews or the various other aspects, social history, which is all important and it all feeds into it, but it's a history of the religion of the Jews. One of the most fascinating chapters in the latter books of the Bible, we're going to talk a lot about the Bible today, is the 8th chapter of Nehemiah. It's not bedtime reading, and I don't imagine any of you have read it before. I've actually carefully put together a Hebrew and English version of it. If you take one and pass it round, we're going to go through it a little bit. Possibly this is the most fascinating chapter in all of the latter books of the Bible. I say possibly because you may have your favorite. It's not a prophecy. It's not obscure. It is narrative. It's full of detail, and it carries in it one of the most important aspects of the evolution of Judaism, from the written to the oral Torah. We all heard those terms. Torah Shabiktav, we all know what that is. We're going to learn more about that today. And Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the oral Torah, which is kind of the traditions around the Torah. How do we interpret aspects of the Torah in order so that we can fulfill the commandments of the Torah? It's all very well to have something written in the Torah and telling you what to do. If you don't know what to do when you read the words of the Torah, it's going to be meaningless mumbo jumbo. The interesting thing about the Torah, and this is the introduction, is that it came with an instruction manual. It came with a system. The Torah wasn't something which was delivered and then God divorced himself from the picture. He delivered it together with a system by which it should be interpreted. We're not free to interpret the Torah as we see fit. We must interpret the Torah according to the system with which it was given. We have indicators that that was the case long before the Talmud. So even though we are aware that the Talmud records all the various debates that took place, in the sense that we need to know how to, for example, observe the Shabbat, how we observe kosher, what we're meant to do in any given situation, how a judge is meant to be a judge, how we're meant to pay compensation, all those things are recorded in the Torah in a coded form, and the decoding of those words are the system with which the Torah was given. We're going to see that very clearly indicated here, with an interesting twist. Let's look at it briefly. This is a description of the first Rosh Hashanah after Nehemiah and Ezra, which was 100 years after the Jews had returned from Babylon. 100 years later, 85, whatever it is, the first Rosh Hashanah, how they behaved, what did they do, how did they commemorate the beginning of a new Jewish year in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's a narrative chapter. Let's have a look. The people gathered as one. I'm not going to read every word. We're looking at the first word. And they spoke to Ezra and they asked him to bring the law of Moshe. Look in the Hebrew. Et Sefer Torat Moshe. I want you to remember those words. Those words are very important. Torat Moshe. What is Ezra a Talmudic book? Is Ezra, Nehemiah, oral law, or is it written? Is it part of the written Tanakh? It's part of the written Tanakh. What is this reference to something called Torat Moshe? What does that tell us about Chamisha Chumshei Torah? And what does it tell us about Ezra and Nehemiah? We're going to look at that a little bit later. Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation. He comes out with a Torah, Sefer Torah. There's men and women. Look at that. He reads it before men and women. It's not a men-only religion. He's reading it before men and women. And everyone could hear, and they understood what he was talking about. It was the first day of the 7th month, the first day of Tishri. We all know that as Rosh Hashanah. He read from this Torah, and everybody could hear him. He read from the early morning until midday. He didn't take any prisoners that morning, did he? He was reading and reading and reading. And he was in the presence of men and women, and of those that could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. Everybody was listening. It seems that this was a very auspicious moment. For the first time in many, many years, it seems since they had come back to the land of Israel, for the first time ever, somebody had come with on a formal occasion, and formally read to them the Torah, the guidebook of Judaism. Ezra had decided, this is it. Now, we know that the Talmud teaches us, I mentioned it last week, that Ezra reintroduced Judaism to the Jews. For some reason, Judaism had fallen by the wayside. They were Jewish, but Jewish by descent, not Jewish by observance. In a sense, in the same way as Moshe introduced the Torah to the Jews at Mount Sinai, and we heard that in last week's Parsha, Ezra, as recorded here in the 8th chapter of Nehemiah, reintroduced the Torah. He was the Moshe Rabbeinu of his day. He reintroduced the Torah in this auspicious gathering on the first day of Rosh Hashanah in that era after the return of the Jews from Babylon. Why that should have been, we don't know. That's lost in time. We have no idea why it would have been that all these years had passed and people didn't know the Torah of Moshe. Why would that have been? We don't know. But we know that he was the one who reintroduced it. And no one questions, and I want to mention that as well. First of all, the reference to Moshe is a direct reference to Ezra. He's reading from Torah Moshe, so the comparison is there. He is like Moshe. But there's more than that. There's no objection here. No one is saying, excuse me, what is this Torah Moshe that you're reading from? Who's Moshe? Everyone seems to accept that this is an ancient manuscript with which we have lost touch. You are now reading it and reintroducing us to this, an ancient manuscript of our faith. An incredible scene. Verse 4. And Ezra the Scribe stood on the pulpit of wood which had made for that purpose, and now read all these names. You've got some Hebrew names, you've got some Babylonian names, Ananiah or Uriah, Hilkiah, Maaseiah, and you've got, if you continue, look at this name, Hashbadonah. Anyone been to a bris recently and heard somebody called Hashbadonah Ben Moshe? I never heard that name before. Hashbadonah was a Persian name, or perhaps a Babylonian name. It's certainly not a Hebrew name. You have here a mixture of names, some of them Hebrew, some of them foreign names. These were the leaders of Israel. These were the leaders of the Jewish people. They drifted away somewhat from their Jewish roots. They're standing there, reintroducing themselves to Judaism. And Ezra blessed God, the great God, and all the people answered Amen. And they lifted up their hands, and they bowed their heads, and they fell down before God with their faces to the ground. We're now at the end of verse 6. And now a whole bunch more names. Verse 8. And now they began to read in the book. They read the Torah. And they gave sense, and it caused them to understand the reading. So everybody was now reading the Torah. It became not a public event at which just Ezra was standing at the podium like I'm standing here, reading a bunch of stuff. Suddenly they were all engaged in the Torah. This is our Torah. We are now studying the Torah. And they studied it, and they understood it. We have here the first inkling that the Torah is not just a book that you read simply to read it. It's a book that you read because you learn something from it. You get something from it. Every person in the Jewish world, every person who's part of the Jewish nation has a chelek, has the ability to understand aspects of the Torah. Torah is not exclusive to the priests or the scribes or the rabbis or the people who live in Jerusalem, or the people who live in Bnei Brak, or Williamsburg, or Borough Park. Everybody has a right to the Torah. Every Jewish person can take that Torah of Ezra, of Moshe Rabbeinu, and make it his own. It's right here in the 8th chapter of Nehemiah. And now, Nehemiah and Ezra and the Levium, they taught the people, and they said, you know what, guys? It's the first day of Rosh Hashanah. It's a holy day today, actually. Now, I'm a rabbi who stood in front of a synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, and I have felt cause to remind people, guys, today is Rosh Hashanah. But you know what? Not one person in front of me on any Rosh Hashanah that I've ever given a sermon has been surprised by that statement. Nor were they in any doubt as to what Rosh Hashanah meant to them as Jews. These people were shocked. This was a gathering of Jews in Jerusalem. They were shocked. Really, they said? Today is a holy day? What does that mean? What does it mean it's a holy day? So he tells them, God is your God. You're not allowed to mourn. You're not allowed to cry. By the way, much later on, when we talk about celebrating Hanukkah, when they declared Hanukkah to be a Yom Tov, they didn't talk about lighting menorah. The same thing. They said you're not allowed to mourn, you're not allowed to deliver eulogies, you're not allowed to weep, and you must give thanks to God. That was what a festival meant in those days. That's what a festival should mean to us. That on a festival day you're joyful, you're joyous, you're happy. It's not a day where you concern yourself about some minutiae of the law. You're meant to feel joy. All the laws are meant to give you a feeling of joy. You can't mourn, you can't cry, you can't give eulogies. It's not a day for eulogies, it's a happy day. It's a joyous day. But it seems that they didn't know anything about it. And he said to them, go home, eat good food, drink good stuff, and send presents to your friends. Give some sense to the day, that today's a happy day, today's an auspicious day, today's a special day, it's Rosh Hashanah. And the people went their way, they ate, they drank, they sent stuff to their friends, and they were very joyful because they understood the words that were declared to them. We're now at 13. And on the second day they were gathered together, everybody was together, and Ezra was there, and he said, the Torah isn't just for one day. The Torah is something which is the lifeblood of the Jewish people. Give it attention. Listen to it. Learn it. Make it a part of your life. Which of course implies that until that time, it hadn't really been a part of their lives. Decades, a century, more than a century had passed by, and the Jews had become divorced from the oxygen of the Jewish faith. Torah Moshe. Ezra was reintroducing it. Well, they looked at the Torah and they found something written in the Torah. It doesn't exactly say in the 8th chapter of Nehemiah what they found, but I know what they found because I've read those psukim many times and you've heard them many times and you know those psukim well. I'm going to read them to you. As Ezra read them to the Jewish people, I'm going to ask you a very pointed question and then we're going to see what happened when he read them. There is...
Why it doesn't say anything about shofar?
It doesn't tell you the details of the day. It doesn't tell you the details of the day. But I'm going to show you something much crazier. In a second you're going to see something much crazier. Listen carefully. The fact that they leave something out is one thing. Nati, listen. The fact that they leave something out is one thing. But when they say something that we know to be different because we practice Judaism in a different way, that's much more curious. That's what we're going to see now.
But giving gifts is something we don't do.
We don't do it on Rosh Hashanah, no. I do like the honey cake. People give me honey cake Rosh Hashanah, that's great. But you're right, we don't give gifts. When do we give gifts? Purim. These are obviously Persian customs, right? The Persian custom of giving gifts is the one which is associated with Purim. Because that was a festival that took place in Persia during the Persian era. So the way of celebrating a festive day in the Persian era was to give gifts to your friends.
Was it just food like you usually do on Purim, or?
It seems like it, because it talks about food. Eat well and give gifts. Clearly that was the type of gift you were giving if you were being instructed to eat well. There's no mention, it's absolutely right, there's no mention of shofar, there's no mention of teshuvah, there's no mention of judgment. But let me just...
Itwell, it's a typical Yom Tov, Itwell.
Hmm?
Itwell it's a typical
It's a
Yom
typical
Tov.
Yom Tov, but not to give gifts of food. I'm going to read from Vayikra, Perek Chav Gimel, and it's from Psukim Mem through to Mem Base. Listen to these Psukim, you've heard them before. Ulekachtem lochem bayom harishon. Which, anyone know which Yom Tov I'm talking about so far? Sukkot, thank you.
Yeah.
Ulekachtem lochem bayom harishon. Pri eitz hodar, kapos tamorim, vanaf eitz ovos v'arvei nochal. What are we talking about? Pri eitz hodar is what? An esrog, thank you. What is kapos tamorim? Lulav. What's anaf eitz ovos? Anaf eitz ovos and arvei nochal is hadassim and arovos. What do we do with those four things? We bunch them together and we shake them and we do it during Hallel. We've got special things that we do with a lulav and an esrog. We all know what you do on Sukkot. On Sukkot, we sit in a sukkah and we shake lulav and esrog. Those are the obligations of the festival. Is everyone clear? Does anyone have any disagreement with that? Would you say that that's a tradition that dates back right to the beginning of Jewish time? I think so. Chukas Olam Levereseichem. We're going to discover that this is something which was not done in the time of Nehemiah. Let's have a look. Verse 14, look at this. I'm going to look at the Hebrew and then the English. Vayimtzu kosev haTorah. And they found, almost chanced upon is the way it's described. They found, like by mistake, randomly, they found that it says in the Torah, Asher tziva Hashem biyad Moshe, that Torah which was commanded through the hands of Moshe. Asher yeshu b'nei Yisrael basukos b'chag b'chodesh hashvi, that they have to sit in a sukkah. Asher yashmiu v'yaviru kol b'chol arei Yerushalayim leimor tz'u ahar. Go to the mountain. V'haviu alei zayis, bring olive branches, olive leaves. V'alei eitz shemen, and olive branches, v'alei hadas v'alei tamarim, and the leaves of hadassim, and the leaves of dates, hadassim and lulovim, v'alei eitz ovos, whatever that is, la'asois sukkos kakosu, to make sukkos as it is written. What did they do with the four species, or at least the three which are mentioned in here, plus olive branches? In their version, whatever their version was, it says nothing about shaking lulav and esrog. They knew that these things were associated with sukkahs. They made a sukkah out of those things. They had a lulav sukkah, and a hadas sukkah, and an arovas sukkah. Yes?
There is a very interesting Gemara in Perek Shlishi of Sukkot, which they discussed which material to do the schach.
Yes.
And there is a Havamina and the Gemara that you have to make the schach from the same species that you make the arova. So
no, this is the origin. This is the origin. But it doesn't say anything about shaking lulav. You talked before about not mentioning shofar. You talk about not mentioning...
Yeah, but depends how you interpret La'asot Sukkot. La'asot Sukkot means to do the chag or to do the actual structure.
No, Vayetzom, look at what the next pasuk says. Vayetzom, Vayoviu, Vayasu lehem sukkos ish al gagu v'chatzresei v'chatzres beis Elokim u'brichov shar Shemayim v'brichov shar Ephraim. Vayasu kol hakol hashovim min hashvi sukkos vayeshu v'sukkos ki le'osu mimei Yoshua bin Nun kein b'nei Yisrael ad hayoim hahu. They went up to the mountains, they collected these things, they made sukkahs. They hadn't apparently made sukkahs like this since the time of Joshua.
So that actually makes stronger my questions. If he said here that they made sukkahs, and in before he doesn't say anything about shofar.
Where is shofar?
Yeah, very shofar.
Shofar's in the book. I mean, the shofar is in the text.
It's in the text, but
they didn't happen to stress it about here. They stressed other things.
The point here, what comes out of here is that this pasuk of Lukachtem Lochem, Arvei Nochal, Pri Eitz Hodor, all these things, begs for interpretation. Without interpretation, you do not know what the pasuk is talking about. So if the Pasuk says, Basukas Teishvu Shivas Yomim, and in the same breath it talks about Lulovim, and it talks about Hadassim, and it talks about Arobos, let's make an interpretation that what we're talking about, as it says in the Gemara, correctly, you bring up
It's
the
a
Gemara,
Havamina. It's a Havamina.
that you make a sukkah out of Lulovim. Not that you shake a lulav. You make a sukkah out of lulovim, out of the palms of the date tree. You make up out of the leaves of a date tree. You use hadassim for schach. That is something which is an interpretation of the words of the Torah, which require interpretation. What you're seeing here is an original, what we call today, midrash. It's an original interpretation of the words of the Torah as found in the written Tanakh. It's not found in the Talmud. This is not something which postdates the closed canon of the Hebrew Scriptures by hundreds of years. It's right there in the text of the Hebrew Scriptures that the Torah itself requires interpretation. But kakatuv, as it is written in the Torah. In other words, this is the interpretation of what is written in the Torah. If you want to do Sukkot properly, you have to bring those things, and what do you do with them? Well, we can see it in the next pasuk. Vayetzuam, they went, they did as they were instructed. Vayaviu, and they brought those things in order to do what? Vayasu lahem Sukkot. They made the Sukkot as they were instructed. Ishal gago b'chatzrotehem. They knew what Sukkot were, but they didn't know they had to make it from those things.
No, but the last article mentions Eitz Avot, which you didn't interpret. There is an interpretation in the English text. And maybe that's what they built the sukkah from, and the other...
Branches of thick trees. Alei Eitz Avot, but the Alei Eitz Avot is the same words as we use. Va'anaf Eitz Avot is the same words that we use in Vayikra to describe Hadassim. Hadassim are the leaves. Va'anaf Eitz Avot is the way that we describe Hadassim, or at least that is the way it is interpreted for us. How do we know about Hadassim from the Torah? The words we use in the Torah, Anaf Eitz Avot, is there in Vayikra. There's 4 things mentioned in Vayikra. Pri Eitz Hada, which is Ezra, not mentioned here. Kapot Tmarim, that we know is from the date tree, that we know is a lulav. Anaf Eitz Avot, that's Hadassim for us. And Arvei Nachal is Aravot. Now, all these things are brought out in Maseches Sukkah, in the Talmud, as to why these particular words were used to describe these 4 species. But here, these 4 species are being described, jumbled a bit perhaps in this narrative, but essentially they're not being used for the way that we use them. They're being used for something totally different. Nobody's saying that they take these things and they use them as part of a prayer service. They're being used here. They're being brought from the hills in order to form the structure, or at least become part of the structure of the sukkah.
So, in one way, if you want to do it, give an explanation, I can explain you that they didn't say shofar, so they didn't say lulav as well. Doesn't mean that it was not
The
exist.
omission doesn't mean that they didn't do that. But
And if you ask me why they use the same species for the structure of the sukkah, I would tell you they will hold by the Havamin of the Gemara. I'm not saying it's an explanation.
yes, but first of all, as you say, it's a Havamin in the Gemara. You certainly do not build the sukkah.
Havamina means that the opinion was exist. It rejects at the end of the day.
There was a conceptually people believed that it was a possible way of doing it, but ultimately that wasn't the final decision. The final law was not decided that way.
Yeah.
But here we have a version of the law where it was decided that way, and it's not any version of the law. This was the Jewish people living in Jerusalem.
Question.
Yes.
What's the time period between Joshua the son of Nun and when this...
500 years.
So, if you take the 500 years, where presumably this hasn't been done, this is what happens when you don't have a custom that's not practiced for 500 years. And the very leader that is explaining this hasn't done it as well.
When he's a priest,
No.
I would assume that it was done in Yerushalayim, and maybe it wasn't done
So I
elsewhere.
think we need to be more forgiving. I'm saying is this...
I'm not unforgiving.
No, what I'm saying is I'm talking about this debate is interesting to me because we all know the details of how you're supposed to celebrate Sukkot. I'm assuming they don't.
They didn't.
And it's 500 years, and that explains that in 500 years you have generations who have no experience with this. And they're hearing it for the first time. And the importance is the desire not the practice. And I'm saying is that's what this brings out. That their heart is in the
I'm
right
told-
place,
this is-
even if
This,
albeit they
I
don't.
told you this is an incredible chapter.
Yes.
This narrative
And that's
chapter is
what's
amazing.
incredible
It's the
about it.
rebirth
Yes.
of Judaism in a way.
Yes, exactly.
But I think your point is that the things that are written in the Torah are not fully explained, and that according to the conditions at different times and different centuries, there has to be an oral Torah which tries to explain how it is supposed to be done. So at the time of Joshua, they just come out of the desert. Where are they going to get palm branches and olives and all these other minim? So at that time, they may not have been able to do it, so they just got whatever leaves they could get. 500 years later, they're living in an agricultural society where those things are available. So they interpret the Torah that you put it on the roof. Things change, and some people are living in Babel. Maybe they aren't available, so then you collect these precious symbolic things and you
shape them.
hold them in the synagogue as a symbol. So the point you're making, as I understand it, is confirmed by these changing situations.
It's,
and the
evol-
fact-
it's evolving, but,
Evolving.
but the most important thing is the interpretation element.
Interpretation, exactly.
The interpretation element is that the Torah is just the code which needs to be decoded. Ezra was helping them decode
No,
this.
So this
Yes.
is indirect evidence that there was an oral Torah.
Oh, that's right.
And
Why do
that's
you
the
say
point.
that?
Sorry?
Why do you say that?
Because
Otherwise, what are they doing? Why don't they just said take those things? Why do you have to build a sukkah out of it? Just take those things.
I have another explanation, another
Go on.
short explanation. It's written by Yom HaSheni, means one day after Yom Kippur. It is not a Chag.
No, by Yom HaSheni they're talking about it. It says there on the 8th day. If you look there, it says
By Yom HaSheni, it's one day after Yom Kippur, no?
B'chodesh Hashvi'i. It says
No, by Yom HaSheni means on Rosh Hashanah, no? On the second day of Rosh Hashanah.
okay, guys, this is a
Okay.
history lecture, not
I don't want to get too. I don't want to get too.
No, because it doesn't talk about the Arba Minim because it's not the day of Sukkot.
Maybe
He just need them. He just
we
tell them to
need build
prepare.
the sukkah, but why build it from lulavim and etrogim? Okay, we'll leave it. We'll leave it. I want to move on. I had wanted to mention this last week. It's an important element of Jewish history of that time, of the 5th century. As the Jewish temple is being re-established, as there are Jews in Babylon and Persia who are still in exile, or at least not in the Holy Land, what else is happening in the Jewish world? Is there another Jewish world? Now, we're not familiar with another Jewish world. In other words, in our recorded history, in that which we know about the history of that time, we're not really informed about alternative Jewish communities until much, much later, until the Greek era. Hellenized Jews in Alexandria. We know about the Babylonian communities. We read in the Talmud how the Rosh Chodesh was declared and all the mountaintops lit up so that people in Babel should know that it's Rosh Chodesh. But what was happening hundreds of years before? I want to describe to you a temple in Elephantine in Egypt. Elephantine is an island in the Nile River. It is to the west of Aswan, which is on the eastern bank of the River Nile. And I don't know if it's still today. I don't know much about the geography in the current time. It's still there. I know that the island is still there, but at that time it was a very important trade link. For some reason, this was a central point, as a market town perhaps, and it was in between the north of Egypt, which was very heavily populated, and the south of Egypt, which was less populated, and Sudan, where there was a lot of materials which used to get exported from that area and imported into the more civilized, I guess, and more populated areas of northern Egypt. Elephantine, you won't be surprised to hear, is the Greek word for elephant. Why was the island called Elephantine? Because they used to, through this island, they must have had a big elephant market there. They used to bring elephants from Africa. They used to sell them in this place, in this island, and it used to go northwards from there, I guess, to the populated regions of the Middle East, or the Near East. In fact, that the name for Elephantine in ancient Egyptian is Yibo, or Yibo, I don't know how to pronounce it, which also means elephants, the Egyptian word for elephant. In the 5th century BCE, which is around the time that we're talking about, Elephantine was home to a Jewish garrison community. What does that mean? I'm imagining that these people were hired mercenaries. These were Jewish military personnel, very skilled at military tactics and strategies, and they were there to protect the Egyptian border. And also, they were associated with the safe passage of products from the south into the north. Why Jews were used, we have no idea. We know that they were there, and I'm going to tell you in a minute why. But what's important, and what's almost incredible to us, because of the Jewish faith that we're familiar with, is that they built there a Beit HaMikdash. A full-blown temple, a Jewish temple in Elephantine. And it resembled Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. It's described, and at some point, at around the time that the second Beit HaMikdash was being built, so around the 5th century BCE, that temple was destroyed. How long it stood for? It could have stood for 100 years, 120 years, 80 years. We're not sure how long it stood for. Let's estimate a century. So it somehow straddled the time between the destruction of the first temple, maybe just before, and the beginning of the second temple, a full-blown Jewish temple. We don't know much about what was going on in the temple, other than that it resembled the temple of Shlomo HaMelech. During the late 1800s, incredibly, a collection of archives, which is known as the Elephantine Papyri, was discovered. They were mostly written in Aramaic, in Hebrew characters in Aramaic, and the archives are concerned with the diverse matters of the Elephantine community. This community of Jews that lived in Egypt described themselves in letters. So they would send letters, but they would keep a record of those letters. And we have at least incomplete versions of these which survived all those centuries, 2,500 years. It's an absolutely fascinating collection. It's documentary evidence which details the life. It's not one of the main centers of Jewish life. It's not Babylon, it's not Persia, it's not Judea. And here we have a description of what was going on. So what was it like? What was it like to be a Jew living in Elephantine? It's a type
These were Jews who had come after the destruction of the temple?
Before the destruction.
So this
If
is,
they came from Judea,
so it
they-
was more than 2,500 years.
well, the records are from that around the time of the exile in Babylon.
So the
the-
second temple.
and later. So at the beginning of the second temple
Second
period.
temple.
Period, yeah.
The
So-
Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan, New York, had an exhibit on these.
On the papyri.
And, yeah,
They're in Berlin.
They're in Berlin. They're kept in Berlin. They were discovered by a German archaeologist or some type of historian who went and discovered them and deciphered them. They're all online. And in fact, I'm going to give one particular important letter I'll give in a moment. Now, I want to be clear about this because this is not ambiguous. These people were Jews. They weren't pseudo-Jews. They weren't converts. They were Jews. These were people who were descended from Jews who lived in Judea, and they were practicing Judaism, at least what they understood to be Judaism, and in fact, very clearly the Judaism that we're familiar with, as you'll see. Their names, their identity, their lifestyles, everything about them was Jewish in the sense of every other Jew of the time. And there's ample proof that, for example, they observed Shabbos, they observed Passover. We're going to look at the Passover letter in a minute. Now, they were not living in total isolation from their surroundings. They were with Arameans, with Egyptians, with Persians, with Babylonians, with all the pagans of the era. And there are cases documented in this archive collection of intermarriages between the Jews and the non-Jews that they were living amongst. And their names, like we saw in Ezra, are both pagan and Hebrew. They've got a mix and a collection of names. Now, the reason why it's so strange that there would have been a temple in Elephantine is because we all know that you can't build a temple outside Eretz Israel. There we have it, it's in the Talmud. We know we can't build a temple outside Eretz Israel. We know that it's very specific that the temple was built in Israel because of our connection to the Holy Land. The roots in the Holy Land that we have is because of the holiness of Jerusalem and the holiness of Mount Moriah. How is it possible that they would have built a temple outside and still considered themselves to be normative Jews? And they did. And not only they considered themselves to be normative Jews, they communicated regularly with normative Jews elsewhere, as recorded in the letters which we have in this archive. We have a law which tells us that we must build our temple inside in Jerusalem. Why? Because we want to keep our connection to the Holy Land. Building and maintaining a temple on foreign soil in a place, for example, like Elephantine, in our Jewish legal system is actually contradictory to the Jewish cause. Imagine we decide today that we want to build a temple in Los Angeles. You know, we're never going to get back Mount Moriah. We buy a big piece of real estate somewhere in the Californian countryside and build a temple.
We call it a shul.
Yeah, that's right. It was the first shul.
So what's wrong with that?
What is-
Not just being a shul.
What is so interesting is the word temple with reference to a synagogue was something which began with the Reform movement. And it was a deliberate use of that word. Until that time, we always called synagogues. A synagogue is a place of gathering, a Beit Knesset. We never had temples outside of Jerusalem. There was only ever one temple. The concept of a temple being outside of Jerusalem is something which was introduced into Jewish life by the Reform movement for a deliberate reason. Because they wanted to disconnect Jews from the land of Israel. We are loyal Germans. We have a temple in Hamburg. This was in 1819. Jüdische Temple. We have a temple in Hamburg. We don't have any aspirations to go to the Holy Land. Because if we have aspirations to go to the Holy Land, that means we're disloyal German citizens. In fact, the greatest, this is perhaps subject for another Jewish history lecture, the greatest anti-Zionists, we always associate anti-Zionism with Neturei Karta lunatics who go and stand with placards outside the UN building. The greatest anti-Zionists of the early period of Zionism were Reform Jews. There was a rabbi here who lived in Florida, a Reform rabbi called Elmer Berger. I don't know if you ever heard of Elmer Berger. He used to write books. He was a virulent anti-Zionist. He had his own independent Reform movement outside of the official Reform movement of the United States. And in fact, if you check on YouTube, as I have, because I once wrote a lecture on the subject, you can find there's a full-length interview with this Rabbi Elmer Berger in his old age in which he espouses anti-Zionism, which would make a Satmar Chassid's hair stand on end. You've never heard such virulent anti-Zionism. And he was, of course, a target of various international intelligence agencies who felt that he probably worked with the Arab cause. I mean, he probably did. He was an anti-Zionist. They felt there was disloyalty inherent in a connection with the Holy Land. It's antithetical to our faith to call a synagogue a temple, because the whole point is that a temple can only be in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. We have a synagogue. We have a place of worship. It's a pale reflection. It's an excuse. We have to have it because we must gather and remain as Jews even in the diaspora. But ultimately, our intention is to rebuild a temple in the Holy Land, in the place where it's meant to be. So I come back to the fact that a temple in Elephantine, at a time when a temple existed in Jerusalem, is to our minds inconceivable. It's hard to understand how Jews who called themselves Jews would have built it. They brought sacrifices there, they had priests there. How is that possible? But they did it, yes.
You had then an example on Bar Sheni called Mikdash Choniot, the same.
Yes.
And Egypt.
Yes, 200 years later.
200.
Onias. Yes, there was a time, we're going to get to that. That was in the Greek era. But that was a very different temple, because there they worshipped pagan gods as well. It wasn't just exclusively Jewish. It was for Jews who was somehow trying to mix it up with everything else. This seems to have been exclusively Jewish. Maybe I'm wrong, but I found no evidence that they were pagan worshippers, who were just looking for, an excuse to remain together as a club. This seems to have been a Jewish temple modelled on the Temple of Solomon.
Do we know when these Jews left Israel? The Jews that came to Elephantine, did they come during the first temple? Or did
I would
they come-
assume that they began coming in the late era of the first temple, the late period of the first temple, but to establish a temple, they didn't do that until probably around the time that the second temple was established in Jerusalem.
I can't remember where I read it.
Phil, First breakaway minion.
Yeah.
I
Kiddush
can't
Club.
remember
Kiddush
exactly
Club.
what
Yeah.
reference I had and where I remember reading it.
So what did
But
they
it was
put?
one
What
of
did
the
they put
early.
inside?
It was one of the early generations
Rabbi.
after Solomon. It goes back
Yes,
hundreds
but
of years
hundreds of
before
years,
that.
yeah.
They were
What did they put
sent
inside?
to garrison.
If-
They were
On
sent
Mizbeach.
by the
On
king
Mizbeach.
of Judea
Everything.
to the south
They just made a copy of it
Egypt.
because the
to
first temple
help
was still-
garrison
was still there.
the southern
Right.
entrance to Egypt.
Because the reason that may be important is that if there was a well-established oral Torah, which by this time, after the first temple had been in existence for
Hundreds of years.
400 and something years, that there probably was an oral Torah that said that the temple has to only be in Jerusalem. So to date them back to Solomon's time could explain why they felt perfectly okay in making their own temple.
It wasn't quite Solomon, maybe
Or
3 generations.
maybe a few generations. Or it could be because, as you recall, and we haven't done a course on the first temple period at all, there were terrible times during that period where both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah were pagan worshipping cults. And they were desecrating both their temples. There was a temple in Jerusalem, a temple in Greece, and they were desecrating those temples. So the point is that it is possible that these Jews were seeking to worship God in a purer and proper sense, and they couldn't do it in the land of Israel, which was going through this terrible time. And they built a temple in Elephantine, and it just persisted. And it persisted beyond the building of the second temple. It did, we know that it did. But it wasn't dismantled, as we'll see.
Did they have their own Kohen Gadol or?
Must have. They had priests. They must have had their own Kohen Gadol. It was modelled on the temple. Everything about it. Now, during the reign of Darius II, the Egyptians, there was a bunch of Egyptian rebels, and they gathered together with some pagans of the time in some Egyptian temple, and they threatened the security of Upper Egypt. There were Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, Northern, Southern Egypt. We're familiar with that. Egyptologists in the room will be familiar with the 2 crowns of the Egyptian pharaoh, one which represented the Northern Kingdom, one which represented the Southern Kingdom. There was always friction between these 2 groups. And at some point there were a bunch of Egyptian rebels from the south who were threatening the north. Of course the Jews were caught in the middle because they were the garrison that were holding the fort, they were holding the line. They were the last barrier of defense against the rebels as they attempted to make it into the northern kingdom. The Jews of Elephantine sent a letter to a Persian official. The Persians were in control of Egypt at that time. It was part of the Persian Empire. And they complained about the fact that Egyptian priests from some temple, the Temple of Knub, were threatening them. They were making threatening noises. We're going to kill you, we're going to destroy you, we're going to take you over. And we have a copy of this document. It's in Berlin, where they complained the Persians did nothing. The Egyptian priests of Knub, I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't speak ancient Egyptian very well. They cooperated with these enemy military forces from the southern kingdom, the southern part of Egypt, and as a result, and this is a direct quote from the Elephantine papyri, the Temple of Elephantine, or Temple of God in the fortress of Elephantine, was destroyed. What's interesting is, guess what they did? They made their own Tisha B'Av. The Jews of Elephantine established a Tisha B'Av to commemorate the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. It was their Beit HaMikdash. It was their temple. And they wore sackcloth, they fasted, they refrained from sexual intercourse, They stopped anointing themselves with oil. They did all the things that we're familiar with from the morning of Tisha B'Av. They did on the commemorative day of the destruction of their temple.
Was it Tisha B'Av also?
No,
Oh,
it was not Tisha B'Av. I don't know the date, but in other words, it's not recorded as Tisha B'Av. It was that day when it was destroyed. The Persians eventually got there, and they punished the Egyptian rebels, and they managed to quell the rebellion, and they kept control of Egypt. I mean, Egypt remained in the control of the Persian Empire right the way through to Alexander the Great, which was 80-something years later. What's interesting is, though, that they did not help the Jews. So, clearly the Jews had not proven themselves to be a useful barrier of defense between northern Egypt and southern Egypt. And they didn't help the Jews. And the Jews got pretty desperate, so they wrote to their brethren in Jerusalem, guys, we're Jews, help us. We need to rebuild our Beit HaMikdash. Well, guess what? No response. So they wrote another letter. It's all recorded in the papyri. Still no response. The last letter, the last dated letter that we have from the papyri is dated 399 BCE. So well into the period of the Second Temple. No recorded response to any of these letters, and the Jews of Elephantine disappeared. Disappeared into history. You know nothing about what happened to them. Did they go back to Judea? Did they intermarry with the local pagan population and just become non-Jews? We have no idea. What we do know is that clearly those who ran the temple in Jerusalem weren't interested in a competitor in Elephantine, and they never sent the funds which were required for them to rebuild the temple there. I'm looking at the time. I just quickly want to run through this. Which I
Question.
think, sure.
I know we're not going to go there. If they didn't acknowledge Elephantine or help them, the 10 lost tribes that I think went on to become the Kurds and the Armenians or whatever.
Right.
But was there any contact with all those Jews that were exiled in
Jews
Syria?
were scattered everywhere.
Yeah, but
Jews
I
were
mean,
scattered everywhere.
they never attempted to revive. We have no evidence that
No,
they
and
did
there's a lot
anything
of
like
myths
help.
and fables, and there's people to this day. It's like one of those, what are those people who try and make gold out of base metals?
Alchemists.
Alchemists. There's Jewish alchemists who are trying to find the 10 tribes everywhere. There's people I know people in Brooklyn who pay money to researchers to find where the 10 tribes went. There were 2 established Jewish communities in ancient history. The Jewish community of the land of Israel and the Jewish community of Babylon. If you lived too far beyond those communities, you strayed very, very distant from Jewish life. The only other community which bears reference is the community of Alexandria, but we know that that was a very uneducated community. Philo couldn't even speak Hebrew. He was Jewish, he couldn't even speak Hebrew. And they had to put up the sign, we know that story, where they had to put up the sign where people had to say Amen, because they didn't know when to reply Amen to the prayers, they were so uneducated. But in Babylon and in the land of Israel, they were educated Jews. One must assume that those Jews who drifted out of Jewish communities drifted away from Jewish identity as well. No different than today, I guess. You know, a Jew living in Wyoming is unlikely to be able to retain his Jewish identity in the same way as a Jew who lives, dare I say it, in Brooklyn.
Is it possible that the Jews in Elephantine were a community, and they got together and they said, let's just build a structure that we can go together, we can pray together, whatever, we can do along the Jewish lines, and not be a bad thing? Why we criticize it? Oh, you're building a temple.
It's not a criticism.
I mean, we're calling it a temple. Maybe it was just a structure.
They describe
that
it
was
as a
set,
temple,
so-
and they brought sacrifices there. It was certainly, even in Tanakh, that would have been something that would have been considered strange.
Why is that different than us building shuls all over the world?
Because we don't bring sacrifices, and we don't conduct temple worship. Nobody, for example, in the Babylonian community, and that's a great example, that was the strongest community of ancient times outside of Israel. Nobody there ever attempted to build a temple. You don't find Jews, and by the way, they were acculturated, and they weren't persecuted. If they would have wanted to build a temple, they could have done it. So at any time in the many hundreds of years that they flourished there, they never built a temple there.
The concept of the temple is that it came from the Mishkan, where God would bring his presence close
That's
to the
right, the
people.
Shekhinah resides in the
And-
temple.
And God authorized
No more
Solomon to make another temple where his
Two temples,
presence
right?
would be closer to mankind,
Yeah.
which did not apply to
Give
his
you lip
temple
service.
anywhere else.
No, correct. I just quickly, I know that we're going to run out of time. Take one and pass it on. Let me have one. Wow. And take one and pass it on. This is very, very quick. I've wandered off camera here. So I've taken here, this is directly from their website. This is the Passover papyrus from Elephantine, which is dated to 419 BCE. And it celebrates the Exodus in the land of the Exodus, is the way I've
They may have joined the Jews in Ethiopia.
could be that they were the forebears of the Jews, yeah. What's interesting is, and I've given you here also Vayikra, same chapter as the one we had before about Sukkot, is the great similarities between the Elephantine papyrus and the psukim that we have in our Torah. Of course, the psukim we have in our Torah, we don't have that much documentary evidence for it. We, in our tradition, say and believe fervently that the words that we have in our Torah date back to long before the papyrus from Elephantine. However, here we have evidence that far predates any other documents, manuscripts that we have, which shows that the Pesach that we celebrate based on the words of our Torah is the Pesach that was celebrated in exactly the same way in Elephantine. So, if you turn the page, I gave you some photographs of the papyri. But if you turn the page to the second page, and you see I've made it bold. So in the Psukim it says, on the 14th day of the month, it's Pesach Lashem. Now, the same way in the papyrus it says you count 14 days in Nisan, and then you observe Pesach from the 15th day until the 21st day. So look at Pasuk Vav in your Chumash reproduction there. 7 days, look back at your papyrus. 7 days, eat unleavened bread, eat matzah. Right? Be pure and take heed, do no work. We have in our Torah. Do no work. Do not drink any fermented drink. And do not eat anything of leaven. Okay, so that's you mustn't eat chometz on the Pesach in Elephantine. And on the 21st of Nisan at sunset, to be crafted Mishal Hashem Shivas Yomim Bayoim Hashvi'i Mikra Kodesh, the same thing. The last day, the 7th day, which here is referred to as the 21st day of Nisan, you also celebrate as a Yom Tov. And look here, I didn't bold that. And this is sent by somebody called Yedanya and his colleagues in the Jewish garrison. Oh no, it's to Yedanya from his brother Hananya. You see here a Pesach described which totally correlates, it's the same, almost identical to the words of the Torah described in an Elephantine manuscript, which is, I mean, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll describe next week or the week after, whenever we get to it, those date to 200 BC. So this is 2 centuries or more before the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have here evidence of a Pesach celebrated in the way that we understand it, according to the words, almost identical with the words of the Torah, as we see in the Torah. Just a vignette. The Elephantine Jews are a vignette of a Jewish community outside of Eretz Yisrael, practicing a Judaism that we understand, that we recognize, that we're familiar with, but who did something which was so far removed from the Judaism that we understand, at least from our version of Judaism. They built their own temple, and then they disappeared from Jewish history. Their version of Judaism, which allowed them to build a temple, was not seen through as, for example, was Rabbinic Judaism, which we are in the process of describing Next week we'll get to the closing of the canon. I don't want to begin that now. I'll take any questions. Sure.
You were talking in the beginning about the oral, what the oral said, the oral word said, and we were having a discussion, this and this. How can you totally trust the oral version when you know there's the game? I say something to Simon, he says it to you, it goes around, by the time it comes back to me, it's totally different. How can you depend on the oral version being what it originally started out with? Because that's what we were discussing.
Okay, so the basic answer to that question is that there was an established list of rules, what we call hermeneutical rules. We read it every day in davening before we say the Kaddish Rabbanon right at the beginning of Shachris. It's the 13 hermeneutical rules. There's another version which has several more, but they are basic rules by which you can interpret a written text of the Hebrew Scriptures. You can't make up your own rules. And even within those rules, there's rules. For example, there's something called a Gezerah Shava, where you use similar words from one chapter to another chapter and use details of a mitzvah that you find over here in the Torah and apply those details of those rules to a mitzvah that you find over there in the Torah. You can't make that up on your own. That has to only come through a tradition. That's the first part of the answer. So you're absolutely right. If it's free-for-all, freestyle interpretation, Judaism wouldn't work. There's a much more important fundamental system, and that's a system of consensus as recorded in the Bible. The Talmud. Although the Talmud is full of debate, a huge amount of debate about every possible mitzvah that you can imagine. Read through the pages of Bava Kama, of Sanhedrin, of Shabbat. You'll see endless debate. We're studying with Steve the Yerushalmi, endless debate about Trumas and Masras, about what it is. But there's a consensus rule. What is that consensus rule? When it comes to the debates between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, there was consensus. We decide the rules according to Beit Hillel. What about the people from Beit Shammai? So the Talmud records that they would marry, the sons of Beit Shammai would marry the daughters of Beit Hillel, and vice versa. In other words, that consensus was broadly accepted, even by those who would oppose. They didn't write themselves out of the faith of Judaism. So oral interpretation is all very well in theory, if you follow the system of rules, and if you agree that a consensus opinion is the final judgment of how a mitzvah should be observed. It may very well be, for example, that people did build the sukkah from lulavim and esrogim, or the leaves of hadassim, and it could very well be, as was recorded in the Talmud that Nati mentioned. But ultimately, we differentiated between the way you build a sukkah as one part of the mitzvah, and the way you use a lulav and etrog as another mitzvah. That was the way the oral interpretation was accepted by the majority, and that's the way we practice Judaism to this day.
You start out by saying that we're going to look at this history of our religion. And this period, just after the rebuilding of the Second Temple, seems like a critical period to try and trace the origins and the continuity of the oral law from the time of Moses to the time of the Talmud. Now, so far, any evidence seems to be extremely indirect. So that the issue that during the time of Nehemiah there was some interpretation is very indirect evidence. It's not referring to a specific oral Torah that was handed down by tradition. And the Jews of Elephantine, who let's say came there in the time of after Solomon, were not calling to ask their brethren in Israel or Babylon what the oral Torah said about this or that. So to go back to this question, what other indirect evidence is there going back during this period or back from this period that there was an oral Torah that was considered to be an authority? And secondly, if all the educated people, or most of the educated people, were exiled to Babylon and only ignorant workers, etc., were left in Israel by and large, and Ezra and Nehemiah came from Babylon and reintroduced it, was there any evidence that Babylon held a center of learning and knowledge of the oral Torah, which only got reintroduced in Israel by Ezra and Nehemiah and didn't exist before that time. What
So I'm
evidence do we have
going
of
to
these
answer
things?
you with the two words I mentioned much earlier on. If you recall, I said there were two very crucial words at the beginning of chapter 8 of Nehemiah. Torat Moshe. Torat Moshe, and I don't want to give too much away because I was going to deal with the canon today, but we got kind of sucked into the Nehemiah oral Torah discussion. Torat Moshe, there's three sections of Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Which is interesting, because we always talk about Torah Shebiktav as if it's one thing. But it's not one thing, it's three things. Where's the division there? And we'll be describing that in next week's lecture, because I'm going to be discussing why there's any division between these three sections of the Hebrew Scriptures. But the fact that Ezra, in this chapter of Nehemiah, refers to a section of Tanakh as Torat Moshe, means that the Jewish people accepted that there was an oracle, a base on which Judaism, there's a fundament of Judaism called Torat Moshe,
Which is the Chumash.
which is the Chumash, which is our Chumash that we read portions of every week.
Or Deuteronomy, at least.
Well, yes. But we have this as a source book for Judaism, but it's incomplete. And Ezra's reading this, and then they're studying it. They're looking through it together. The Leviim, which is a code word for what we would call rabbis, are interpreting it. They're helping these simple workers, as you describe them, understand what the words of the Torah mean, not in terms of what they mean, but in terms of what they mean to them, how it's going to affect them. What are the halachot? What are the directions that the Torah is giving them? So there is this concept of Torat Moshe. There is a fixed law book called Torat Moshe, but that law book is never going to be enough to give a Judaism that we can all subscribe to unless it's going to have some type of interpretative system.
Well, but the interpretive system, the concept that we understand from Mount Sinai is that we were given not only the Torah Shebichtav, but also the Torah Sheba'al Peh.
Yes.
If that were the case, and if the Torah Sheba'al Peh that started with Moshe and he taught all the judges, there would have been a complex of laws that had come indirectly or directly from Moshe's interpretation of God's word.
What we call halacha Moshe Misinai.
That we would refer to that was outside of the Chumash, whereas in Ezra and Nehemiah, all he's referring to is the Chumash.
He's referring
and it's possible the Levites were explaining to the best of their ability how to observe the exact words of the Chumash. Where is the indirect evidence that these Levites were saying, well, this is according to the Chumash, but this is according to the oral law?
It's indirect, it's not direct.
Indirect.
We know that from the Talmud. The Talmud records that Ezra introduced Judaism. And I would answer your question about Babylon, is that yes, it was the center of learning, and that the 3,000 exiles who were dragged away by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon were the cream of Jewish society in terms of scholarship, in terms of leadership. And he took them deliberately. It was a decapitation of the land of Israel because he wanted to control it. He was concerned that the kings and the king's advisors would never allow him to control this country. The Jews were troublesome people, and they'd proven troublesome to the Assyrians, and he didn't want to have the same problems that Sancherib had had. He wanted to get control of the land of Israel. He didn't succeed the first time. It took 2 or 3 times until he finally got control. He had to destroy Jerusalem and raze it to the ground to get control of the Jewish people. But those 3,000 who went to Babylon and the exiles that came afterwards were the cream of Jewish life, and in the main stayed in Babylon. So their descendants and their descendants continued. Babylon was the longest standing community of Jews.
Yechezkel is standing in Babylon.
Yechezkel, who we're going to talk about next week, whether or not his book should have been included in the canon of the Bible. Yechezkel lived in Babel. He started off his life in Eretz Yisrael, but he was exiled with those 3,000.
The Talmud of Yirmiyahu, what's his name? I forgot. Baruch ben
Baruch
Neriah.
ben Neriah.
Yeah.
They lived
He
in Babel.
recorded in the Tanakh. Yeah.
Yechezkel's book is profound prophecy, one of the most profound prophetic books in our Tanakh. And he lived in Babel. Of course, it's not Torah Sheba'al Peh, his is prophecy, but it seemed that the scholarship of the Jews was not in the land of Israel, and it took hundreds of years to be re-established there. And Anshe Knesset Agdola, slowly but surely, there were the different schools. There was Shammai, there was Hillel, then there was Rabbi Akiva, and there was all the different rabbis that we're familiar with from the Talmud. These all came much, much later, in the time of the Greeks and later the Romans.
Just one final interpretation. I mean, they knew well what a sukkah was, because when they came back to this desolate mountaintop, everything had been destroyed.
They had to build
So they
sukkahs.
lived in Sukkot like the original Jews who left Egypt. Lived
Yes.
for 40 years in Sukkot.
They
So
were looking
everybody,
for a ritual sukkah.
right.
They
Well,
were, they were looking for a ritual sukkah to celebrate Sukkot, not a sukkah in which they lived.
right, but I mean, they had the blueprints.
They had the blueprints, but they hadn't celebrated Sukkot as a festival in
Right.
this fashion since the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. Well, by the way, there's interpretations in later commentators, the Talmud, and everybody talks about this. But look at it face value. It's always good to look at the pshat and the pasuk. That they hadn't celebrated Sukkot in this way since the time of Yehoshua ben Nun. Okay, we'll leave it here for today. Thank you very much.